The elections were between the far right candidate Keiko Fujimori of the Popular Force, the name of her political party. Her father, Alberto Fujimori, was a dictator between 1990 and 2000. He is currently in jail. He was convicted of several corruption charges as well as for gross violations of human rights. And he's serving out a 25-year prison sentence. Keiko Fujimori has vindicated her father's government. She sees him as her model. He works very closely on her campaign, and she's promised that one of the first things she'll do, if not maybe the first thing she'll do when she comes to office, will be to pardon her father and free him from prison. The other candidate is Pedro Castillo, a virtual unknown. He's a school teacher from the rural area of the northern Andes, Cajamarca. He's been active in the teachers' trade union movement, which is very powerful in Peru. And he did have a brief moment on the national scene in 2016 when he led a national teacher strike. And he's representing the Peru Libre, the Free Peru Party, which is actually a party whose president is a former governor in the center of Peru, Junin, whose name is Vladimir Cerrón. There have been certain questions raised about him. He was convicted of corruption to 4 years not long ago. His party is on the left. And so what's ended up happening is you have had a very polarized campaign. The first round elections were April 11th. And these were the top two vote getters among a very crowded field. There were something like 18 candidates. So neither of them, in fact, won a great deal of the vote. Castillo won 15%. Keiko Fujimori won a little under 10%. But they were the top vote getters, so they proceeded to the second round vote on January 6th. So in that 2-month interim, right, these two candidates were running their campaigns. And Peru is already a very divided country. It's divided by race, by class, by region, and in the context of a leftist, rural, indigenous school teacher versus someone on the right who comes from what is in effect a political dynasty, the Fujimori dynasty, very close to her. She was once a congressperson. Her brother was a congressperson. She's supported now by the elite of Peru. This turned into a very polarized political contest. And initially, Castillo in the polls was ahead of Keiko Fujimori by around 20 points, which is a significant margin. But there were a lot of people who were undecided. And in those 2 months, there was a very intensive fear-based campaign by Keiko Fujimori and her supporters with the backing of the mainstream news media. One commercial group, El Comercio, owns 80% of the mainstream media in Peru. And their main message was, Keiko Fujimori, yes, Pedro Castillo, no. And it was often cast in very racist and very classist terms, right? Because Castillo he's rural, he's a farmer, he's a rondero, which is the rondas were these kind of local defense units organized by farmers to protect their land, their homes, their communities from, cattle rustlers and other criminal delinquent activity. And they're an organization that has a lot of prestige in Peru as sort of civil society-based local authorities in the regions where they are active. So it's been very polarized, but you add on top of that the ideological polarization, the leftist, rural, indigenous person of the left wanting to change the existing system in Peru. Peru has had a free market, extremely neoliberal economic system since Keiko's father, Alberto Fujimori, was in power in the 90s. And though some presidents were elected promising to change the neoliberal model, once they became president, they quickly changed their position. The kind of the classic example that was Ollanta Humala, who was elected similarly on a sort of a leftist populist platform of change, became president, dropped all that, and kind of stuck with the existing neoliberal model. So Castillo promises to change the economic model, but also he wants to change the constitution that was put in place by Keiko Fujimori's father after a coup d'etat backed by the military, shutting down the Congress, taking over the judiciary, and dissolving the 1979 Constitution, which was the result of a democratic process. So this is a constitution that was put in place by a dictatorship. Let's see, what else can I say about the Keiko Fujimori campaign has, used. Oh, and I guess I should say that Keiko Fujimori is someone who defends the status quo. Right? She defends the status quo. She defends the constitution her father put in place. She defends the free market neoliberal economic system that her father put in place. So wealthy elites who support the free market system, of which they benefit quite directly, have rallied to Keiko Fujimori's side, even though I don't believe they necessarily are Keiko lovers, right? In the first round, remember, she only got 10% of the vote. But because she's the person running against Pedro Castillo, for the middle class, for the elite who are fearful of a leftist president and whose fear has been grossly manipulated and played upon by the Fujimori group, they've rallied to Keiko Fujimori's side as sort of a defense against a leftist government. And the scenarios they've painted it's actually kind of, if it weren't so sad, it would be funny. But they paint Castillo as the next Hugo Chavez or the next Maduro, so a Venezuela-style, debacle. They portray him as, similar to Fidel Castro, wanting to come in and install a Cuba-style dictatorship. Sometimes they refer to him as part of the Shining Path, which was a Maoist insurgent movement that was active in the 80s and the 90s, who vowed to overturn Peru's democracy and implant sort of a primitive rural communism. And, there's no real evidence that Pedro Castillo has any real ties to the Shining Path, which in and of itself is not really relevant anymore anyway. There are small armed rump groups of Shining Path in the rural areas acting in consort with drug traffickers. Politically, they have very little. It's not that they don't cause any damage. They do cause some damage, but politically, they're not really very relevant. There's a small political group called Movadef that's tried to gain inroads in teachers' unions and in other spaces. Presumably, he made some alliances with them at some point, but to say that means he's a member of the Shining Path and is going to launch the armed revolution if he takes power, I mean, it's absurd on its face. So they've really exaggerated those fears to undermine his candidacy. So that's sort of the background. When the votes started coming in, Keiko was slightly ahead. Keiko Fujimori was slightly ahead. That was really because she, in fact, was much more popular than Castillo in Lima, which is sort of the center of middle and upper class elites, who overwhelmingly favored Keiko Fujimori. But as the votes from more rural areas started coming in, the results shifted in favor of Pedro Castillo. And once Pedro Castillo moved ahead of Castillo, he never lost his lead. At one point, it was 100,000 votes ahead of her, but it narrowed to around 44,000 votes. So it is a very narrow lead, you're correct. But once Keiko realized she was losing, she began claiming that there was fraud at the election polling sites. And she began presenting examples of irregularities, presumed irregularities, as evidence of fraud. Now, we all know that in any elections there are some irregularities. That does not necessarily mean that there is fraud. And she was very quick to backtrack and make sure that she wasn't claiming that the elections authorities were carrying out fraud, but that Castillo and his followers were presumably carrying out fraud, which is, virtually impossible. This is a fairly new organization with very little ability to organize itself, let alone organize a systematic nationwide fraud. And in fact, the examples they brought to bear, they brought, example after example to the elections authorities claiming fraud. And one by one, they've been discarded by the elections authorities as having no substantive value. And so, just to give you some examples, one claim was that there was one elections table where three of the citizens who are called upon by the elections authorities to help tally the votes, they had the same last name. And so the Keiko Fujimori camp said they are family members. It is a violation of the elections rules for family members to sit on the same elections table together. Therefore, this is an example of fraud. Well, in fact, they weren't family members. They just happened to have the same last name. So that was discarded. And they, in fact, sent a team of lawyers, especially to the rural areas where Castillo won a vast majority of the votes, and where presumably people are poorer, some are illiterate, where there might be more of a likelihood of these irregularities that they could then claim as fraud. So some could say that there's an active effort to disenfranchise poor rural Peruvians simply because they voted for the other candidate, right? But in fact, what's happened is the elections authorities are nearly done reviewing all the claims that the Fujimoristas have brought prior to the deadline and have found no real evidence of fraud. There have been international and other national bodies that have observed the Peru elections, and all of them agree that it was a free and fair process. In fact, the United States Department of State claimed that these were a model of democratic elections for the transparency, efficiency, and impartiality that was displayed by the elections authorities around the country. So the narrative of fraud has proven to be really baseless. There's no real evidence. And yet Keiko Fujimori and her supporters continue to advance a narrative of fraud. And at the same time, they're working on all these different fronts to pursue this fraud narrative and one way or another prevent Pedro Castillo from being proclaimed president. In one scenario, the elections authorities accept the claims of fraud and disappear a certain number of votes for Pedro Castillo, which would put Keiko over the top and declare her the winner. Plan B is to declare that these elections were fraudulent, to nullify the election results and convene new elections, which has no real basis in Peruvian constitutional law, but it is a plan B that the Fujimoristas are putting forward as a possible alternative way of preventing Castillo from becoming president and getting Keiko Fujimori or someone else in the presidency. Pedro Castillo is, as I said earlier, a rural school teacher, Catholic, a trade unionist who holds he holds Marxist views, so leftist on the sort of political and economic front, but he also holds deeply conservative views that sort of align with the views of the Catholic Church and some evangelical churches on issues such as LGBTQ rights, women's rights, reproductive rights that are of concern to people who care about human and civil rights. And I do think it's interesting to see the evolution of Castillo from the first round vote when he was catapulted into the second round, and today where he's listening to the criticisms of his party, his program, some of his own deeply held views. And I feel like he's heard the concerns about, the party that he stands for has called for, very aggressive radical economic reforms. He's heard some of the concerns around that, and he said, okay, I'm going to name Pedro Franque, who's he's a leftist economist, but he's someone who's not advocating, nationalizations or state takeovers of the economy, but rather he's advocating sort of Keynesian style economic policies, right? In wherein the state would become more active in redistributive policies, presumably, but not in a whole scale, nationalization program. He's also called for the current head of the National Reserve Bank, Julio Velarde, to remain in that position, which I think is intended to calm the market concerns about his presidency. So he's clearly able to understand that some of the proposals that he's put forward may need some modification, but he also has to respond to his voters who are so enthusiastic about him precisely because he is proposing change. He is proposing to alter at least some aspects of Peru's free market system, which has resulted in extreme levels of inequality, in which, Peru, which is, one of his campaign slogans was Peru is a rich country, and why are there so many poor people still in Peru? Right. So he really needs to respond to his base, which wants to see some economic reform. So there's going to be a delicate balancing act, and it will, remains to be seen how he's going to address it. But I do think he's been attentive to the criticisms. Now, we have yet to hear from him on these social conservative values issues. Different human rights organizations, including my own, have met with advisors to his campaign, raising concerns, right? And they've been heard, and we're waiting for, a response. So it is our hope. And he's made alliances with other members of the Peruvian left who are very clearly supporters of these civil and political rights that we're so concerned about. So hopefully there will, but there is definitely going to be some, contention there. So I think, we'll see how that all plays out. But that's a very important question, I think, to keep in mind. If I can, I'd like to go back to the slow motion coup question, because I feel like there's some aspects that I didn't cover that would be interesting for your viewers to understand, because I think that the Fujimori campaign is not only trying to get the elections authorities to rule that there was fraud and that she's the actual winner, because there is a plan B. The plan B is to have these election results declared null and void and to convene new elections. There's a whole series of machinations going on within the national elections boards. One of the members who's close to Fujimori has resigned, even though he's technically not allowed to resign, which is creating all kinds of turmoil within the elections board, which is tasked with reviewing the final questions about the ballots and proclaiming the winner of the elections. If a winner is not proclaimed by July 28th, the person who is the president of Congress becomes the interim president. Now, that would have been Martín Vizcarra, the former president who was removed from office last year by this Congress on very spurious grounds. But he's not going to be allowed, apparently, to take his seat on Congress because of corruption charges against him. So the second most voted member of Congress is Jorge Montoya. He is a retired Navy admiral who was elected into office with Renovación Popular, which is an extreme right, Opus Dei connected party, who's very close to Fujimori. He was very close to, he was an active duty admiral when Fujimori's father was president. During that time, Fujimori and his top advisor, Vladimiros Montesinos, had hundreds of senior military officials sign a loyalty oath, right, to Fujimori and Montesinos, to the 1993 constitution that they put in place, to the coup that they carried out in 1992, etc. So this is someone who's very close to Fujimori. He would be elected president, interim president, and he would either presumably nullify the election results and convene new elections, or maybe he would stay in power. He's been seen in protests of ex-military officials claiming that there was fraud, calling for military intervention to prevent Castillo from being proclaimed president and convening new elections. He's signed letters to the heads of the army calling on them to intervene. So he's engaged in what some might call seditious behavior. So there's all kinds of things going on outside of the actual counting of the ballots that are trying to manipulate and change the outcome of this process, that threaten to undo and upend not only the Peruvian elections, but perhaps Peru's democracy itself. And so that to me is very concerning. I'm very fearful of Peru sort of returning to sort of the Fujimori of the 1990s, where corruption ran rampant, where human rights violations were the lay of the land, where hundreds of indigenous women were forcibly sterilized without their consent as part of a family planning program. So there's a lot to be concerned about there. There actually were several international observation missions to the elections on June 6th, including the Organization of American States, including a European Elections Commission mission, including the several local bodies in Peru, the Human Rights the Ombudsman's Office, the International Transparency Office in Peru. They all observed the elections, and none of them found any instances of fraud. So there's, I think, compelling evidence, right, from the elections observers, international and national, that these elections were, in fact, clean, fair, transparent, and impartial. And in the context, I mean, it's been now, 22 days since the election occurred, and this turmoil about whether there was fraud or not, and all these other machinations that I've described. And in that context, a number of governments around the world have begun issuing pronouncements. So, for example, the United States Department, I think I mentioned this earlier, the U.S. State Department issued a statement noting that these elections were a model, that they've been carried out freely and fairly, and that the U.S. looks forward to working with the next government of Peru once the elections authorities work through these final, questions over the ballots and proclaims a president. The Canadian government has done the same. The British government has done the same. The EU has done the same. And so I think that the international community, the consensus of democracies around the world is that, in fact, these were free and fair elections, that Pedro Castillo, he may have won by a narrow margin, but he won, and that it's important to respect that process. Obviously, we want to watch the Castillo government and make sure that they also remain within the margins of Peru's democracy, that they are respectful of the rights, especially of vulnerable minorities, including the LGBT community, including women, so on and so forth. But I think that, we'll see how it all plays out. I remain concerned about efforts to overturn the election and the machinations going on at different levels. So I think it's important for the international community to remain vigilant and to continue to support democratic actors in this process in Peru.